Am I the asshole for cutting ties with my family after years of being overshadowed by my disabled sister's needs and feeling invisible? Emily, my younger sister, has always been the center of my family's existence. Even though she is a year younger than me, it has always seemed to me like she lives in a completely different universe that is solely centered on her. Because Emily was born with a physical disability and ongoing health problems, her life was filled with doctor's appointments, treatments, and special accommodations. Naturally, my parents devoted nearly all of their time and energy to making her life as easy and happy as possible, and I could see why. Nevertheless, it also meant that I was abandoned at a very young age. I took on the role of the easy and healthy kid, which came with the expectation that I needed less care and upkeep. I learned early on not to worry about it because Emily's needs always came first. I would nearly always stay behind when Emily couldn't, either at Aunt Linda's or with a neighbor, depending on Emily's ability to cope. They would frequently say, "We will bring you next time." But I never felt like it would happen. I didn't simply miss the big family holidays. Emily was almost always at the center of even the small everyday activities, like going to the park, buying ice cream, or watching a movie with the family. Sometimes I could comprehend it logically, but it still hurts emotionally. Her needs always came first, even though I would be excited about the idea of us all doing something together. I felt unnoticeable. The first time I truly felt the weight of being forgotten was on one of my birthdays. I must have been 8 or 9 years old by then. There was no cake, no celebration, and no acknowledgement of the day. I woke up that morning with the thought that maybe, just possibly, something unexpected was in store for me. However, as the day went on, it became very evident that my parents had completely forgotten my birthday. Their main goal was to get Emily to a concert that she had been anticipating for several months. They talked enthusiastically about the performance when they got home. As I listened, I questioned if they were even aware that it was supposed to be my special day. It wasn't until the next morning that my mother realized her error. Even while I appreciated the gift card she hurriedly grabbed as an afterthought, it was painfully obvious that the excitement of Emily's concert far outweighed my birthday in their universe. For many years, this pattern persisted. My parents were constantly focusing on Emily, and I was expected to accept that. Being understanding at all times, avoiding conflict, and blending in while everyone else's needs were taken care of was a heavy burden for a young youngster. I felt more noticed and appreciated whether I was by myself or at friends' houses, so I started spending more time there. A year ago was my 10th birthday. For weeks, I had been hinting that I wanted to do something fun. Like go to the arcade or throw a pizza party. It was significant to me because I was finally getting close to double digits. As my birthday drew near, however, it became very evident that nothing was scheduled. I wanted them to surprise me, but I forced myself not to get excited. Maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. On the morning of my birthday, however, there was no celebration. There was no mention of it during breakfast, and the day went by like any other. Emily was the center of attention because she had been having a rough week with her health. Even though I knew she required more attention, I still felt disappointed. My school friends recalled, wished me a happy birthday, and even collected some money to buy me ice cream for lunch. It was a small thing, but it made the day seem less empty. I thought maybe my folks would remember when I got home that afternoon. However, the house was silent, and my mother was on the phone setting up Emily's next therapy session. My father was still working. It should come as no surprise that no one acknowledged that today was supposed to be mine. Trying to make the most of it, I went to my room. What is the point of saying anything? It wouldn't make people remember, and it certainly wouldn't make them feel sorry. The following day my mother finally realized she had missed my birthday again. She apologized and explained how busy she had been with Emily. As usual, I nodded and claimed it was all right, but it wasn't. Even though I knew in my heart how things would work out, they assured me that we would make up for it that weekend. I desired to have faith in them. We stayed at home during the weekend though, because Emily wasn't feeling well enough to go out. Rather than celebrating or doing something special for Emily, we watched her favorite movies. As an afterthought, my dad brought home a store-bought cake, but by that point, it felt more like a consolation prize than a celebration. It served as yet another sobering reminder that in my home, Emily's needs and desires always came first. I had given up on having many dreams by the time I turned 12. I didn't focus on making any requests or offering any agenda suggestions. I spent the entire day playing video games, doing my homework, and helping out around the house. That year, my parents did remember to wish me a happy birthday, but there was a brief acknowledgement before everything was back to normal. That day, Emily went to see another doctor, and she was the center of attention again. That birthday hurt the most. Even though it wasn't particularly awful, not because of anything noteworthy, but rather because of how typical everything was. Habitual neglect as opposed to malicious neglect. My needs barely registered since my parents were so accustomed to giving Emily all of their attention. They neglected not just my birthdays but also my accomplishments in school, my hobbies, and the things I held dear. The acknowledgement was swiftly followed by dismissal. Resignation hardened by the disappointment. I stopped expecting something different as I grew older and realized that this was just the way things were. Celebrations of friends' birthdays began to act as a reminder of what might occur. At home, however, the story was consistently the same. As the years went by, I became accustomed to my invisibility. My parents constantly seemed to be somewhere else, so I learned to have modest expectations. It wasn't like they didn't care about me in their own way. Even though Emily's requests were always more urgent, more immediate, and somehow more important, I started to emotionally distance myself, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. It was easier to be satisfied with coming in second, third, or not at all, and it was easier to not expect anything. During all of this, my grandparents were my lifeline. They were the ones that noticed the small details about me and gave me a sense of importance. Every time I went to their house, I had the impression that I had entered a different realm where I could see myself. Making everything unique was something my grandmother was particularly skilled at. Each time I went to see her, she let me pick out something to bake. No matter what we made, cookies, cupcakes, or even simple spaghetti, she had an old recipe book that was worn and battered. Her kitchen was our thing. My childhood was filled with joy on such afternoons. She made sure I understood that I was more than just another kid, I was her grandson. Grandpa, however, was the reserved type. Although he didn't say much, he was trustworthy and always present. He loved model trains. His basement was crammed with tracks, little houses and miniature scenery. I loved how he included me in something he enjoyed, not because I was a rail enthusiast. It was the only area where I didn't feel like an afterthought, and I spent hours down there with him. My grandparents complimented me on every small achievement I made that my parents didn't notice. After I scored my first soccer goal, Grandma prepared a special dinner and baked a cake. Grandpa even put the ball I used in the game in a small display in the living room. They made it feel like a huge deal in their place. Even though it was just a local soccer match, it was important to them because it was important to me. However, such pleasant things are always taken away by life. It was 3 years ago that Grandma fell unwell. It was a long fall, reflecting the slow erosion of my childhood happiness. It wasn't abrupt. She continued to attempt baking with me at first, but as her condition worsened, our sessions shifted to my sitting next to her bed and holding her hand as she slept. Long before she was gone, I missed her. Her death truly broke my heart. It felt like losing everything when I lost the one person who gave me a sense of belonging. The funeral went very quickly. There were many faces expressing sorrow, but it didn't feel genuine. Although Grandma was no longer with me, it felt more like a piece of me had. After that, Grandpa changed. His once warm eyes became aloof. Our visits decreased, and he stopped hanging around with his trains. What had been my sanctuary felt chilly and empty now. Because the house was too full of memories, Grandpa eventually went into a nursing home in a different city. I could understand why it was sold, but it still felt like another aspect of my youth had been lost. It wasn't the same when we went to see him once a month. The antiseptic visitor's room lacked the coziness that had previously made our time together memorable, and our visits were short. We were both unable to mend the raw wound caused by Grandma's absence. The barrier against the loneliness I experienced at home disappeared after Grandma left and Grandpa moved far away. Everything became controlled by Emily's needs, and life resumed as it had always been. The contrast, however, was suddenly even more noticeable. My grandparents made me visible where my parents had unintentionally rendered me invisible. It was absorbed by every family decision, every discussion, and every medical procedure Emily had. My words appeared to disappear as soon as they left my lips when I tried to discuss friends or school. They didn't appear to be picked up. I became more reclusive at home, and I typically declined friends' invitations to hang out at the university. It was easier to avoid queries about why I felt the need to pretend everything was all right or why I was always so miserable. Everyone was aware of Emily, of course, but nobody had any real idea what it was like to live in her shadow. Since Emily did not select her health problems, I felt ashamed, but that did not make the actual suffering of neglect any less genuine. Specifically, the guilt was awful. I felt terrible because I wanted more attention. And I was upset that Emily was constantly given priority. Feeling important was more important than merely getting attention. Despite my parents' best efforts, I still felt like I was peering in from the outside. At this point, I brought up family therapy for the first time, but I had no idea what to anticipate. I thought I'd give it a shot. My parents consented, much to my surprise. Maybe they thought a professional could assist close the growing distance between us, or maybe they didn't know what else to do. In any case, we were seated in a calm office with a therapist who appeared sincere in wanting to hear from each of us. We started going to therapy sessions on a regular basis. I was a little optimistic at first that things might get better. I was able to finally communicate what I had been experiencing for a long time early on in those sessions. I expressed my desire for them to take notice of my hobbies and recognize my achievements, as well as how it felt to be the one neglected. It had been a while since I felt as though my parents were actually paying attention or that they recognized the profound impact their deeds, or lack thereof, had on me. They appeared taken aback, possibly even shocked. Tears, apologies, and vows to improve were exchanged. For a few moments we appeared to be moving forward. My parents paid closer attention and were more considerate. They found time for me alone, for things that weren't Emily's purview. We went bowling, saw a movie, and visited a museum. Even though it was unpleasant at first, it felt great to be the center of attention for a brief while. But Emily was aware of the shift. Since she wasn't used to sharing the limelight, her jealousy quickly surfaced. Small remarks like how much fun we must have had without her or how wonderful it was for her to have some alone time at home were the first subtleties. However, those comments quickly became more. She sobbed throughout dinner one night, saying my parents were favoring me and ignoring her. According to her, the reason they loved me more was because I was normal. My parents were shocked by the accusation and hurried to console her. We started to lose the delicate equilibrium we had been establishing. We stopped going on family vacations as often, and when we did, Emily's jealousy took center stage. My parents went back to their old methods because they couldn't decide whether to include me or control Emily's emotions. It quickly became evident that I was only living in Emily's reality once more. I felt bad for disturbing things, so I proposed that we resume our regular routine. I decided that accepting my position on the sidelines would make things simpler for everyone. However, our therapist disapproved of that notion, reminding us that the purpose of treatment was to disrupt these negative habits rather than to strengthen them. Even though it seemed like we were going nowhere, we persisted. The majority of our sessions were dominated by Emily's sentiments of envy and abandonment. Even in therapy, which was meant to benefit all of us, she continued to take center stage. Despite my frustration, I failed to find a solution. One session reached a breaking point when Emily accused my parents of loving and preferring me more. My parents went into a self-doubting, guilt-ridden spiral after the accusation. The progress we had been making was compromised as they rushed to reassure her. It was tiring to see the same patterns being repeated over and over. I started to question whether going on with therapy was really necessary. I was so exhausted. I was simply exhausted and no longer upset. I'm tired of attempting to articulate how I feel and of holding out hope that things will improve. I began withdrawing once more, both from the treatment sessions and from my family. I started to lose the tiny hope I'd been holding on to, the hope that perhaps things could be different. That change occurred within me. I came to terms with the fact that this was the way life would be. Therapy had become just another ritual in which I expressed my emotions, only for Emily's desires and sentiments to take precedence over mine. My parents couldn't come see me since they were too involved in Emily's life. I accepted that information as true. I had lost my anger. I had exerted every effort to draw their attention to me and help them comprehend what it was like to be ignored. However, it was obvious that they were set in their ways, and I was out of energy to challenge it. I started to completely stop going to therapy. What use was it to repeat the same things over and over again if nothing was going to change? My parents were aware of my increasing distance, but they were unsure of how to respond. They seemed to be only going through the motions when they tried to interact with me. Whether they inquired about my day or made awkward attempts to strike up a conversation over dinner, there was no genuine connection. My withdrawal was also observed by Emily. She had a mixed response. On the one hand, she was glad that she was once again the center of attention. There were still a lot of questions, on the one hand. She started questioning me about trivial topics, such as my after-school activities and the games I was playing. She didn't know how to connect, and to be honest, I didn't either by this point. We were both unable to overcome the hurdles that had been put in place by years of mistrust and misunderstanding. I began focusing on my studies and personal hobbies. I made friends, joined groups, and concentrated on things that had nothing to do with home. It was comforting to be surrounded by people who knew Emily yet recognized me for more than just her sibling. I came to understand that I didn't need my family's approval by spending more time at school and with friends. I could establish my own personality without having to worry for my sister's demands. One day, during a particularly difficult therapy session, everything came to a head. I had been listening in silence as the therapist brought up Emily's sentiments of envy and desertion once more. She was always the focus. I had made an effort to speak up earlier in the session, describing how it felt to be repeatedly ignored. However, the topic quickly returned to Emily's difficulties. I was used to it at this point, yet it seemed different that day. Perhaps it was the years of frustration building up, or maybe it was the understanding that I had had enough. I paused the session after taking a deep breath. I told them everything. I had the impression that my family was looking straight through me. How I had given up on the idea that things would be different. How Emily's needs always came first and birthdays, accomplishments, and little moments had become meaningless. I described how agonizing it was to watch them defend the necessity of the current situation and how I had finally realized that nothing would change. The room was quiet after I was done. My parents were surprised, as if they were unaware of how deeply I was hurting. The harm was already done, even though the therapist made an effort to steer the discussion in a more constructive direction. My parents defended themselves rather than owning up to the damage they had caused me. They discussed how difficult it was to balance everything, how important Emily's health was and how they were trying their hardest. Emily joined in, saying I was attempting to make her feel awful over something she couldn't control. When she was the one dealing with actual difficulties, she accused me of being selfish for seeking attention. I wasn't surprised by what she said, even though it hurt. The hidden lesson that my feelings were not as significant as hers was one I had heard before. The therapist made an effort to diffuse the situation, but the damage had already been done. That's when I knew nothing would change. My parents were unable to see past Emily's needs, and Emily was only able to see her own difficulties. I never really succeeded in making room for myself, so I was caught in the center. For me, that session was a turning moment. I made the decision to stop trying to make things better. I kept being caught between Emily's and my own demands after that. Now though, I was simply worn out. I had lost my anger. Peace was what I desired. The conflict was no longer interesting. I became progressively more reclusive during the following few weeks. I concentrated on my studies, looking for internships, college scholarships, and any opportunity to travel far from home and be independent at last. I started searching for distant colleges where I could start over without having to worry about the dynamics of my family. I craved distance, both physically and emotionally, even though I loved my family. I rejected my parents' suggestion that we consult a different therapist to get a different viewpoint. I had given up on attempting to fix anything that was too damaged. Despite their apparent disappointment, they didn't press the issue, either because they were growing weary of the never-ending battle or because they were starting to realize that some wounds couldn't be healed. However, Emily didn't appear to notice that I was withdrawing. She was once again the center of attention, and she was perfectly content with it. Every now and again she would inquire about my plans, but our discussions never progressed past the obvious. I didn't see a way to close the distance between us now that we had drifted apart. I became more and more preoccupied about my future. I applied to colleges, went to college campuses, and put myself into getting ready for life beyond high school. My grades improved, my friendships grew stronger, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making progress toward a personal goal. I was creating a life apart from Emily, my parents, and the never-ending cycle of letdown. In the end, I received acceptance to a college in a different state. I could travel home if necessary, but it was still distant enough for me to be independent. When I told my parents, they were pleased for me, but I also felt sad. They must have seen that this was my method of bidding farewell to the family dynamics that had continuously molded me. They made no effort to persuade me to remain nearer to home. Rather, they only sent me their best wishes and said they would come see me when they could. I felt as though a burden had been removed when I left home. The independence that came with living alone thrilled me. I moved into a tiny dorm room after packing my belongings. The initial weeks were peculiar. The silence and the lack of Emily's incessant demands were unfamiliar to me. However, I quickly adapted to my new existence. I joined groups, made new friends, and found that I liked having my own identity. I was able to be myself for the first time in years, not the forgotten sibling, not an afterthought, just me. It was freeing. I discovered that I didn't miss home as much as I had anticipated as the months went by. Even though I continued to communicate with my parents, the distance gave me the freedom to unwind and discover my identity without having to worry about family responsibilities. I became aware that the resentment I had harbored for so long was beginning to lessen when we spent time apart. I no longer had animosity toward Emily, and I was no longer upset with my parents. Even though I hadn't always appreciated their best efforts, I now realized that they had done the best they could. Learning to let go of my expectations brought me serenity. Life in college was enjoyable. I was surrounded by individuals who noticed me, paid attention to me, and gave me a sense of acceptance. These close companions turned into family. We commemorated accomplishments, birthdays, and even the minor triumphs that my family had frequently disregarded. I was no longer only an afterthought for the first time. Being a part of something was an incredible feeling. Even though I had discovered a new sense of belonging, I still missed my family. I stayed in touch, but we only had surface-level interactions. The deeper problems that had afflicted us for so long were never explored. Reopening old wounds was something I wasn't sure I was ready for. So, liberated from the shadow of my past, I carried on living my life and making it genuinely mine. It wasn't flawless, but it was sufficient. I had been looking for a place where I could just be myself all my life. I had finally located that location. With time, the distance between my family and I became more about emotional isolation than it was about geographic distance. I was finally starting my own life without the burden of my family's past. I wasn't just existing at college, I was thriving. For the first time, I felt appreciated and seen for who I was, not only for what other people at home had classified me as, and I made friends who truly liked me. I would still occasionally contact home, mostly out of duty, but those conversations always felt pointless. My parents would nod courteously when I told them about my friends or school, but it was always obvious that Emily was still very important to them emotionally. As soon as I brought up her name, the topic of conversation would go back to her most recent health information, difficulties she was facing, and how she was handling everything. When it felt that my life was merely a footnote in their world, it was hard to stay involved in such discussions. I couldn't fully give up on the possibility that things would change in the future though. I was depressed even though I had long since moved on from the grudge. There was still a secret longing for a family that would embrace me the way they did Emily. My parents would simply give me a quick phone call or a fast text message to mark milestones, holidays, and birthdays. I had given up on expecting anything more by that point. I rejoiced with my pals, who had become my real family. They were the ones who made me feel important, who remembered my birthday, and who were there for me when I needed them. During my last year of college, I made the decision to spend Christmas at home one year. Since I hadn't been there in a long time, I reasoned that perhaps enough time had gone by for things to feel different. Perhaps I had changed and matured enough to manage the dynamics that had before overwhelmed me. The house was the same when I got there, yet something felt different. Maybe I was the difference. Perhaps the area that had made me feel so small was now too small for me. My parents' cordial welcome gave me a fleeting optimism that this visit would be unique. However, the old patterns quickly reappeared. Once more, Emily was at the center of every discussion, her needs, her challenges, her accomplishments. I listened politely, but as the days passed, I noticed that I was emotionally withdrawing and reverting to the corner I had occupied for so long. It seemed as though I had never been gone. Christmas morning was the decisive moment. My folks hadn't remembered to buy me anything. There was nothing for me as we sat around the tree exchanging gifts, no name-branded item, no sign of appreciation. I saw Emily's happiness light up the room as she opened her presents. My parents valued her so highly that they were oblivious to my silent existence. My life had been fashioned by years of overlooked milestones, forgotten birthdays, and subtle neglect, all of which were brought back to me in that moment. This time, however, I experienced acceptance rather than rage or sadness. I had finally come to the point where I didn't require their approval or affirmation. I didn't need them to congratulate me because I had learned to do it on my own. I silently packed my belongings that night and departed early the next morning. There was no conflict, no spectacular departure. I was aware that I had at last reconciled with my childhood family. Knowing they wouldn't change, I just turned away. However, I realized that I no longer required their space. In a family that didn't know how to provide for me, I had spent years trying to find a place for myself. In the world I had created for myself, I had discovered that place somewhere. Life continued. I got a job in a distant place after graduating with honors from college. It was everything I had ever wanted. A new beginning, a clean slate, unencumbered by my family's past, and the freedom to become who I truly wanted to be. For the first time, I felt genuinely pleased with what I had achieved, and my friends joined me in celebrating by throwing a party in my honor. I became acutely aware that my happiness was independent of my family after spending time apart from them. We never delved into the underlying concerns that had created our relationship. Instead, our interactions remained superficial when I periodically visited home. And that was all right. I had given up attempting to alter the fact that Emily would always come first for my parents. As the years passed, my life kept changing in unforeseen ways. I created a life that felt completely unique, surrounded myself with people who appreciated me, and got a job I enjoyed. I had discovered how to be happy without looking to my parents for attention or praise. I still occasionally think about my family, including Emily and her life to this day, as well as my parents, who still focus on her. I'm curious whether they ever consider me. If they ever consider what they missed or how things ended. I don't think about it though. I've moved on and accepted that things will always be difficult in my connection with them. In my opinion, a family is made up of everyone who supports you, accepts you for who you are, and loves you without conditions, not only your biological relatives. With more love and support than I ever imagined, my friends have grown to be like family. Though I've learned to love myself enough to let go of the desire for their approval, I will always adore my parents. The fact that I've created a happy life is ultimately what counts. I am incredibly thankful for the lessons I have learned, the strength I have acquired, and the person I have become as I sit here now and think back on the path that has led me to this point. I never lost myself, even though my family may have forgotten me in many ways. And that's what matters most of all, I've come to realize. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.